Welcome to the RLC Liberty Lounge. My name is Walter Hudson. I'm Vice Chair of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Minnesota and your host for this activist webcast covering local, state, and federal politics with an eye toward promoting individual rights, limited government, and free markets. I'm joined on the panel today by RLC Minnesota board member and coordinator of Liberty Minnesota, Karl Eggers. How you doing today, Karl?
Good, Walter. Thanks for having me.
Of course, always glad to have you on the show. And our special guest on the panel today is the state chair of the Minnesota College Republicans. Welcome, Aly Eichman.
Hi.
It's good to have you here, Aly.
Yeah, nice to be here.
We're leading off tonight with our headline topics. We're going to start with election law in our state. The Republican Liberty Caucus of Minnesota has joined with Liberty Minnesota in a broad bipartisan coalition of civil engagement organizations to advocate for the restoration of voting rights for felons who've been released from incarceration and live among us in the community on probation or parole. Now, this has been a controversial position which has attracted a limited amount of organized resistance. And now the Star Tribune reports that the Senate has passed an elections bill that includes voting restoration, but would also establish an early voting program, allowing Minnesotans to vote beginning 15 days prior to Election Day through 5 p.m. on the third day before Election Day. And apparently there's some other reforms involving elections involved in this bill as well. So my question to you, Karl, knowing that you've been working hard with me and with the Republican Liberty Caucus and Liberty Minnesota on the issue of restoring the vote to folks on probation and parole, what's your take on how this process has panned out? And do you have any reservations about early voting or any of the other provisions in this elections bill?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think the advocates and the people on the front lines of this bill, like Sarah Walker and the Restore the Vote Coalition, I understand what they're doing, including this in the elections bill. It makes sense logically and also from a strategy perspective of getting in multiple places where it can have the greatest likelihood of succeeding and of passing both chambers. That being said, it's really tough that it's in these omnibus bills that usually contain way more junk and pork than they contain positive reforms. So it's frustrating to see it tied in with things that we don't necessarily agree with, or definitely not as gung-ho. I see it as more of a, does the ends justify the means? And usually they don't, right? Just because we want to get felon voting, we want to restore voting rights to those out on probation and parole, which I think is an awesome thing. It's fulfilling, and it needs to happen. Doesn't mean that we need to include all these other wasteful pork reforms in there that we probably don't even need as a state and we don't agree with as liberty people. So conflating those issues makes it really tough to support this bill, but I think it's a problem of omnibus bills more than it's a problem of restoring the vote. So I get the strategy, it just makes it really tough to be gung-ho on that specific omnibus bill, knowing that there's some good things in it, but a lot of bad and not great things in it as well.
So kind of a related question for you, Karl, because I know that you work with Liberty Minnesota on putting together a legislative scorecard. How do you guys handle situations like this where you have omnibus bills or bills that are full of things that aren't necessarily part of your issue, but there's some kernel in there that you do support?
That's a good question. Well, if you ignore the fact that omnibus bills are generally unconstitutional, we have the single subject clause in the Minnesota Constitution that has been loosely defined by courts that omnibus bills are constitutional. We would tend to disagree, and I think a lot of conservatives and liberty-minded people would disagree. They think that the legislation passed in the House and the Senate needs to cover a single subject, and just saying public safety or elections doesn't really cover that. So in terms of the scorecard, yeah, omnibus bills are generally no-goes for us. Again, it's just because there's one or two or a couple good things in these bills, which usually there are, doesn't mean you can justify a vote for all the bad things in those bills as well. So if the most recent elections bill was down party line votes too, so I think you'll see a lot of conservatives and liberty people vote against those most of the time, knowing that those omnibus bills are notorious for being filled with pork and waste and regulations that our state doesn't need. So if you support those as a legislator, what other things do you support, and what other things are you authorizing that you normally wouldn't if it was out on its own in a standalone bill?
So, Aly, has there been any buzz among the college Republicans on these election issues? For instance, and maybe it's not something that has been actively talked about, but just off the top of your head, do you think that early voting would help students in any way?
Honestly, there hasn't been much of a buzz among college students, and I don't think apathetic's the right word, but just a large percentage of students don't know and don't want to take the time to learn about election laws. But we've found that early voting and absentee voting options are popular among young people, but many don't know that those are options for them. I know this past cycle in St. Cloud, we had a lot of first-time voters for the conservative side of things because of absentee voting. College students like the idea of sitting on their couch watching Netflix all while doing their civic duty of voting and getting that out of the way. So
yeah, I mean, we definitely live in an app culture, don't we, where it's probably a matter of time before there's going to be an app for voting, 6 months prior to the election. That's the direction things are going.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on, Governor Mark Dayton said Monday that he and Senate Democrats had agreed on a K-12 school funding increase that is double what Dayton originally called for, opening an even wider gulf between Democrats and House Republicans in the final week of the legislative session. Dayton upped his school spending demands after a private meeting with top DFL lawmakers. Later in the evening, Dayton and leading lawmakers from both parties resumed their negotiations, trying to bridge differences on major pieces of the two-year budget. So, Aly, we'll start with you this time. What do you think Dayton's angle is here? I mean, we're constantly hearing about the importance of compromise in the legislative process, right? You hear that all the time, especially on our side of things, that, in order to be practical, you have to be willing to compromise, you have to be willing to negotiate and come to the middle. So why would Governor Dayton, at this late hour in the legislative session, be moving further away from a deal?
I honestly don't know Dayton's intentions. Maybe he thinks he can get away with it. Maybe he's gotten some backlash from the more progressive wing of the DFL. Who knows? But working across party lines is incredibly important, especially now that the Democrats don't have complete control in Minnesota, so they're not going to always get what they want here anymore. And I think Mark Dayton backing off from negotiations with the GOP and reverting back to partisan politics isn't moving Minnesota. It's just making everyone really frustrated.
Yeah, how do you take that, Karl? I mean, do you think that there's a double standard that's being employed here, or is there, just from a completely, if you could try to be objective about it, is Dayton perhaps doing the right thing? Is he doing, from just the perspective of a political consideration, is this something that Republicans should be doing? Should Republicans be trying to move further to the right and put a stake further in the right when we get closer to these deadlines in order to try to move the political center?
Yeah, that's a great question, Walter. I think that it's tough because the reason Dayton increased his amount that he wanted for education was due directly from lobbying from the school districts and from the teachers unions, that they want more money. Therefore, he says, oh, I think we have an opportunity to get more money here from Kurt Dowd, so let's keep going. So politically, yeah, I think it's very smart. And of course, I think the Republicans should stick, goes more to the right, especially when you're in the initial negotiations or in the middle of negotiations. It's tough to swallow, knowing that he doubled his own request, and even Bach in the Senate was a little surprised by that. But I think it's a smart strategy, and it shows what he stands for. And he stands for doling out money to special interests and to lobby groups. The teachers union being a big one, and I think that makes a lot of sense for him politically. It would be great to see the right do the same thing in terms of our base, not in terms of doling out to special interests, of course, But in terms of staying stronger to our base and saying, no, this is where we stand, and these are our principles that we stand on. Dayton wants to, give as much money as possible to unions and to schools. I don't think that, giving more money to education is leading to better outcomes, as we've seen over the last few decades. But in terms of negotiation, I think he sees an opportunity with doubt, and he jumped on it.
So let's explore that opportunity a little bit, because I think you're right. So if you had to guess, where do you think the final increase in education spending is going to end up? Because originally I think the Republicans started with an increase.
Right.
If memory serves, it was somewhere in the area of 0.5% in education spending. And Dayton was originally calling for 1%. Then he threw out 4%. Now he's back to 2%. But obviously the momentum is heading in spending more and more. So where do you think this is going to end?
Yeah, you're right. So the number that passed the House was about $150 million, which is a 0.5% increase in education spending. So right now we spend about $29 billion on K through 12 education. So about 0.5% would be about $150 million. Yeah, I mean, that's where we started. That's where the conservative, hardcore fiscal conservatives started in their budget, is saying we want $150 million more towards schools, and we expect $150 million better in terms of outcomes and test scores and graduation rates, I guess. So if the difference is between 0.5 and 2 right now, then I have to say somewhere around, it's going to be around a 1% increase. Knowing that they take money from transportation and from other budgets to kind of do a shell game here, I assume it's going to be around a 1% increase, where the Republicans will cave on education because it's tough to be anti-education in terms of cutting education spending. On the same token, we'll get some of our things in terms of the gas tax or others. So it'll go up more than, probably closer to $300 million. But yeah, we're started off in a terrible place negotiation-wise.
Aly, what's your sense of how folks in your circle of influence regard this debate that we continue to have over compromise and bipartisanship versus being aggressive and putting a stake in the ground and trying to drive your agenda and move the political center? Do people want to see more bipartisanship and compromise and conciliatory behavior, or do they want to see people out there fighting for what they believe is right?
I think it's a mixture, because I think there's a very fine line between compromising and working together. So I think young people like to see principled candidates, principled politicians who stick by their guns, but at the same time they find something that they have in common with another person in office, and they work together to get that done. And I think we can see that in like data privacy in Minnesota, things like that young people love.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So Walter, I mean, those things aren't mutually exclusive, right? You can still work in a bipartisan way while sticking to your principles. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think people get confused in terms of, well, compromising is being bipartisan. Well, no, compromising means giving away some of your principles, right? And maybe there are times to do that, and there are issues to do that on. But that doesn't mean you can't stick close to your principles, especially on the key core values like privacy, constitutional values, reducing spending, things like that. But on the things we do agree on, let's work together. Let's be bipartisan, and let's really push the ball down the road in terms of liberty and conservative values.
All right, we're going to move on to a segment we call Be It Resolved, and this is our rapid-fire debate segment where we take a few more stories working their way around the internet and debate them pro or con. And Karl, we're going to start with you. St. Louis Park is considering becoming the first city in Minnesota to ban plastic bags and polystyrene food containers. Some states like Missouri have taken the proactive step of banning such municipal bans, actually telling cities that they can't do this. So here's your topic, Karl. Resolved, Minnesota state legislators should pursue legislation banning municipal bans on plastic bags and similar products. Will you be taking the pro or con position?
I'm going to take the con position on this one. I hate bans altogether. Can we just ban bans, I guess? I mean, that's what I'd like to ban. But no, honestly, like if somebody is going to ban something as dumb as plastic bags or have a regulation as irrational and logical as that, I'd rather have it in the local level where I can easily say, okay, St. Louis Park is doing this dumb thing. I'll go to the Target 2 miles down the road in Hopkins and get my plastic bags over there. Versus the state determining for everybody, saying nobody can have this good or everybody has to have this good. I think it's more advantageous for the local levels to make that decision, as bad as that decision may be. But no, we shouldn't be banning anything, including bans.
Aly, what do you think?
Well, I'm actually going to agree with Karl. So issues like this are tough because I don't agree with the bans on plastic bags because I kind of think that's a little stupid. But I don't like the idea of making more laws, because that's not exactly limited government. And the government is best when it's local. So if, like he said, a local place decides that they don't want plastic bags in grocery stores and stuff like that, well, then go down the road. It's just like I don't like the federal government superseding state laws. I don't really appreciate the state superseding local laws either. So, yeah.
I'm going to mix it up a bit, and I'm going to take the pro position on this. And I'll start off by saying I completely agree with the notions that you guys are forwarding, the idea that local control is better than centralized control. However, I also look at it in the perspective of what's the end result? What is it that we're trying to accomplish through government? What's government for? And my answer to that has always been the protection of individual rights. And so when you go back to, and this is a very dramatic example, but you go back to Jim Crow and the Civil Rights era and the interaction that the federal government had with the states and with local municipalities in terms of getting rid of segregationist legal policies where people were being forced by more local authorities to discriminate against people who maybe in a market situation they didn't want to discriminate against. That was a situation where, yes, the federal government acting in a centralized fashion dictated to lower levels of government what they ought to do. However, the end result of that particular mandate was liberty. It was freedom. It was leave people alone. And so it's a dangerous road to travel down, I'll grant you, to have a centralized authority dictating to a lower government what their policy ought to be. But in a case where that action is being taken in a very objective sense to protect individual rights, I would oppose to it. I'll at least say that. Right. So we'll move on from there to our next topic. A recent Draw the Prophet contest hosted by Islam critic Pamela Geller attracted an attempted terror attack by 2 gunmen who were shot dead by police. In the aftermath, debate has erupted over Geller's role in provoking the attacks. So, Aly, this resolution comes before you. Pamela Geller was irresponsible in hosting an event provocative of Muslims and needlessly placing people's lives in danger. Will you be taking the pro or con position on that statement?
I'm going to take con. Because I agree, she was irresponsible. The competition was mocking a popular worldwide religion, but she's not responsible for gunmen showing up. The shooters are responsible. It doesn't matter what someone said to you. You cannot shoot someone because you are offended. I think it was Ron Paul that once said, we don't have the freedom of speech to talk about the weather. We have the First Amendment, so we can say very controversial things. And I think that applies a lot here. Some people think that what we're doing now, discussing liberty, critiquing the government, might be offensive, but thankfully in America, we have that right to continue, and I think that's important.
Karl, what do you think? The statement is Pamela Geller was irresponsible in hosting an event provocative of Muslims and needlessly placing people's lives in danger. Pro or con?
I don't know which one's pro, which one's con, but I guess I'll disagree with Aly on this one because I agree that Pamela was irresponsible. So while I support Pamela's constitutional right to do what she did, I think that she needlessly put people's lives in danger. Because of course, doing an event like this, even in a red state like Texas, may cause certain reactions in people, as we've seen for the last how many years, that things like this does make people very mad. An extreme fraction of a group of people make them very mad. So I don't know what the outcome or what the goal of this event was, but I think she got her, I don't think she intended to get death and murder, but I think she got the reaction out of the extreme Muslim community that she wanted for publicity or for other things to prove her point. So I think the group itself and the event was irresponsible, but I don't think that means she doesn't have a right to say that in our country. She has the right to say that and to organize those things, but maybe it could have been done smarter in a more intellectual way instead of provoking anger in others.
Maybe this was a bad choice for pro and con.
Yeah.
It's difficult to sort out the weeds, so to speak. But the position that I take on this is a little more aggressive. Is it irresponsible to provoke a tyrant? Is it irresponsible to provoke a bully? If you know that exercising your right is going to cause somebody to violate your rights, are you irresponsible then for living free? I have a hard time agreeing with that sentiment. And I think the point of what Geller was trying to do in as crude of a fashion as perhaps she and her allies attempted to do it was specifically to say, listen, in the face of threats, because that's the thing, this never would have happened if it wasn't for the fact, she wouldn't have put on this event if it wasn't for the fact that there are people out there who say, we will kill you for drawing a cartoon, right? I mean, so the whole point of it is, no, I'm not going to yield to that. I'm not going to back down and grant legitimacy to your threat by saying that I don't get to express myself because you're going to turn up and threaten my life.
I think it's more than that, though, because she wasn't just defending and being mean to the terrorists. She was being mean to an entire religion that's very popular around the world, with a lot of people that are peaceful, nice people, even in our country. And I think that, I don't know if irresponsible is the right word, but I think it was inappropriate.
What do you think, Karl?
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, Walter. I think you can live free and still try to not make dumb decisions. So, just because I'm totally free, I can go in and tell people off in public and call them all sorts of names, doesn't mean that that's the best thing for me to do, knowing that I can't have my physical rights violated, that I can call you a jerk to your face, but you don't have the right to hit me, right?
Right.
Well, is that really the best use of your freedom? Maybe not best use is what I'm trying to say, but is that the smartest use of your freedom as a free individual in the United States, to push your rights to the limit, and aggressively and using belligerence in front of people when you know the outcome and you know how people react to that? There's got to be a better way to make the same argument, to say that, hey, you're a jerk. Maybe I can say that in a more constructive way, without provoking physical violence that you say you're going to commit if I call you a jerk. So I don't know. I mean, I get it. I think it's her right to say what she did and to draw whatever cartoons her group wants to draw. Of course, we all agree on that. But there's got to be a smarter way to make the argument that freedom of speech in America thrives and should thrive and includes all these kind of ideas that may be controversial to others.
And from more like a PR perspective, she's not making a lot of people like her position anymore.
Right.
She's making people hate her and hate people who defend her. So I don't think she's making the movement any easier.
I'd be more inclined to be sympathetic to that argument if her and her allies were rolling up on a mosque and standing outside standing outside an Islamic community center and holding signs and shouting things and throwing cartoons of Muhammad in their door and whatnot, then I'd be inclined to say, okay, now you're pushing the limit of what you reasonably ought to be able to do. Sure. But to me, the obligation is on the offended party to use their freedom of association to insulate themselves from speech and actions that they don't want to be exposed to. Nobody's forcing you. Nobody forced these two guys to get in a car and load up their guns and drive over there and deal with it, right?
Sure.
That's a choice that they made. And if we're going to have a tolerant society, we're going to live in a free world, then it's necessary that we be able to handle, like adults, the fact that other people are going to say and do things and draw things that we find offensive. And this is an extreme example of that.
Yeah, so going back in my history, my experience, as a freshman at the University of Michigan, right after 9/11, I led a procession of students, and we walked and we desecrated the United Nations flag. Because we did that in the middle of campus because we didn't want the United Nations to tell America what America can and should do. I still believe that, but was that the best use of our argument in a public way and in a way that promotes peace and love and intelligence? Probably not, but as a college freshman, it was a lot of fun, and we got a lot of coverage out of it. So
That's what college is for, right, Aly?
Yep.
Right. It wasn't a college Republican event, but it was another Liberty group. But I think the same way Pamela, that's not the best way to make the argument that she probably wants to make. But it got a lot of attention. It got a lot of people talking, i.e. us. And maybe there's some good things to take out of it, knowing that it probably, I think, is still responsible for her to do what she did.
All right, let's take a few minutes to talk about the Minnesota College Republicans. Aly, what is your organization all about? Are we just talking about a pool of potential interns here to go out and do grunt campaign work, or is there more to it than that?
No, not anymore. We've grown as an organization a lot the past couple of years. And going into this next year and the year after that, we're prepping for 2016 already. What we're going to do is we're already working on our field plan for 2016, and we're going to win the youth vote, whether Minnesota likes it or not. But we are bolstering our activism so we can grow our membership throughout this next year because there isn't elections. So then by the time the campaigns all start, and they're starting earlier nowadays, but by the time campaigning starts, we're more than just interns. We have our own separate plan. We have our college campuses with goals, and they're working with candidates in campaigns, not just working for them. And we're going to make a huge impact. That's the goal, at least, in 2016.
What do you perceive to be kind of the barriers, if any, and I'm assuming there are some, to young folks just getting involved, period, but then specifically getting involved on the Republican side of politics?
Well, I mean, young people in general are a little apathetic about politics, and it's not because they don't have opinions, they just don't care enough to get involved. They don't care about the process and the system. They have opinions, but they don't want to affect change as much. And specifically with Republicans, our biggest issue is our brand, the Republican name. A lot of young people, so I think under 25, so millennials especially, they're much more conservative than Generation Xers. Which is surprising because we're supposed to be young and Democrats, but they don't like that. They don't like what's been happening in our country for years because the future doesn't necessarily look brighter for us at the current state we're in, and this is one of the first generations to be like that. So we blame everyone ahead of us, Republicans, Democrats, all of them. So what we're trying to do in Minnesota, at least in the College Republicans, is recreate our brand so it's much more inclusive. So we have a lot of one-issue voters who are young, and we're trying to make it so they feel welcome in the Republican Party. So if you disagree with us, on an issue or two, but you agree with us 70, 80% of the time, we want you to join our organization and volunteer and feel like you're welcome. So we're going to be the open, inclusive party on campus, which is going to be really different than in the past, because that's the Democrats' buzzwords, but we're changing that.
Yeah, I suppose when you take into consideration that we're in the second term of Obama's presidency, from the perspective of folks who are in college today, their entire political consciousness has taken place under a Democrat regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is the status quo, this is the establishment, and so that kind of natural youthful rebellion against the status quo, against the establishment, ironically, is going to be directed to some extent against Obama, against Democrats, against the guys who are in charge. Do you perceive that to be the case?
Oh, definitely. And the College Republican National Committee actually came out with a report, I think it was a year and a half ago now, and they did a lot of polling of different buzzwords, different issues among young college student-aged people, and one of the things they found is there are more independents within college-aged students than ever before. They're not identifying as Democrat as much, but they're not necessarily, they haven't warmed up to the Republican brand yet, so they're just kind of in between. So they're up for the taking for any party, and they're much more fiscally conservative than in the past, and they don't trust the government at all. They don't trust Congress, they don't trust state governments, they don't like being told what to do, and we think that there's a good avenue for that within the GOP right now, especially going into 2016. There's some awesome candidates, and the Democrats aren't offering anything new. They're not offering anything inspirational, I don't think. And one of the things is, in the report, they mentioned that what young people look for in a candidate more than anything else is that they're trying. And some older people that this was actually discussed on Bill O'Reilly when it first came out, and he wasn't super complimentary of that. And he was like, what about policy? What about this? And it's like, a lot of young people don't know about certain policies yet. We're young. We're figuring things out. So we want candidates and we want people in office who care and are trying to make things better, because we can forgive a lot of things, but if they're there for the wrong reasons, that's unforgivable in our eyes.
All right, that's all the time we have tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the RLC Liberty Lounge. Connect with the Republican Liberty Caucus of Minnesota on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at RLCMN. You can email us at rlcminn@gmail.com and consider becoming a member of the Republican Liberty Caucus by visiting rlcminnesota.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to share a link to this video with your friends. Aly Eichman, where can people connect with you online?
Well, either on Facebook, which is just Aly Eichman, A-L-Y, and then E-I-C-H-M-A-N, or on Twitter, same thing. Also, you can check out our website. It's mncr.org. It's really awesome. We're revamping it soon, so stay tuned.
Karl Eggers, where can people find you online?
Yeah, Facebook, Karl with a K, K-A-R-L, Eggers, E-G-G-E-R-S. And you can connect with Liberty Minnesota on Facebook as well, and libertyminnesota.com. You'll catch up on all our latest things, including the Liberty Laurels coming out in a few weeks.
All right, and my name is Walter Hudson. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter at Walter Hudson. Check out my daily podcast, Fightin' Words, which you can find at fightinwords.us. That's Fightin' Words without the G.us. Until next time, take care.